Okay, so on we go today in the world of graphic design. Today is going to be all about how we organize content on the page. I'm going to actually show you a bunch of examples of posters today so that it kind of feeds you into that next assignment so you can start thinking about where you're going, what your poster is going to look like, and that sort of thing. So we'll get a lot of prep for that going. When we sit down for the demo portion of today's lecture, we're going to talk about some of the more advanced features, how to align things, how to create spaces between various images. So it's all about alignment tools and that sort of thing. But before we get into that, we're going to talk about structure and organization of your design. And I'll start by first talking about grid systems. And you've probably heard about grid systems before. It's a great way to start and kind of have an underlying backbone behind your graphic design and or architecture or industrial design, landscape design, etc. We'll start first by talking about some of the components of these grid systems and what makes up the grid system. Some of this is pretty self-explanatory. Other parts I think are worth talking a little more in depth. I'm going to start first with the margins. And you guys are all familiar with margins. These are the things that go around the outside of the page. Essentially what they're doing is they're blank space that defines what is the active area of the page, where's the content, and what is the passive area of the page, what's outside of the content. It doesn't mean that there can't be elements inside of the margins. So you could have footnotes, you could have page numbers, you could have those kinds of pieces of information in the margins, but they're not the active content. They're supplementary content. They're things that help you understand what's going on, not the actual content itself. So they're really about, these margins are about directing you toward this is what the important stuff is on the page. They vary in size depending on the format. Heck, some things they don't even exist. Sometimes there's no margins at all. They sometimes contain the subordinate elements, which we talked about going forward. So in this graphic, I'm going to keep repeating and showing this graphic. The area around the outside here is the margin on this particular page. Columns, again, fairly self-explanatory. You're all familiar with columns. Columns essentially are vertical divisions of space that are used to align elements. They may divide up the page. You may have multiple columns on a page. If you think about a magazine usually, or a newspaper, that's the easiest way to think about multiple columns on a page. They may be just one column. Your English paper or your history paper that you turned in technically is a column. It's just one of them. And it's a little bit larger. The widths vary according to the function of design. When you turn in your English paper, it's usually a bunch of text, and so we have a nice big column, and you fit all the text on that page. If you have a lot of visual elements like photographs that are mixed in with the text, sometimes it's nice to have multiple columns so that you can kind of piece those images in along with the text. So our columns are these areas here, these vertical divisions of space. Next, we have something called a column interval. It could be a gutter width. That's another term for this. But essentially, it's the space in between the columns. And if you're going to have multiple columns, you have to have these column intervals. Otherwise, everything would collide together. If you imagine for a second you pick up your favorite magazine and you go to read, and there weren't any of these column intervals between the columns, you'd be reading along one line of text and you have no idea where to stop before the next line of text started. So you have to have that little bit of breathing room. That's what defines the column in the first place. So there's always going to be a column interval paired with a column. They're inactive negative spaces that separate one column from the next. So in this particular graphic, it's those blue areas. It's the space in between the columns. Next thing is a flow line. A flow line is kind of like a column interval. The difference is that we turn it horizontally and run it across the page. And so I think this particular graphic, the example here that I have with the little red arrows, that really shows a clean flow line across that page. So we've got a nice horizontal line that's separate from the columns, that's separate from the pictures, and it really defines the page and gives us a nice focal point as part of the page. This is a great way of enhancing your designs. You add that one single flow line into the page, and suddenly it really leaps bounds ahead in your design. You could have multiple flow lines. You could have one flow line. It could vary from page to page. We'll do a whole lecture on portfolios. That might actually be the next lecture. I have to look and see. When we talk all about portfolios and portfolio layout, you're going to see these flow lines really appear. And that's part of what makes a really strong portfolio page to page is to have these flow lines running through your particular design. Now in this case we have 3 different options. It doesn't mean that those exist on every page. It's just 3 different options for where those flow lines could appear. Grid modules are spatial areas that support this textual and visual data. You could have a number of modules depending on your design. So depending on how small your design is, you could have more and more of these little modules. Essentially what it is it's the column that's divided by the flow line. So we define this by the column and the column, or excuse me, the flow line and the column interval. There's more in here. I just couldn't show it. If I did it, it would just look like columns because they'd all be blue. But essentially it's every one of these little squares that you see is a grid module. Yeah, it could be like a thumbnail. I think one of the challenges, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, how do you size one of these particular pieces? Thumbnails tend to be really small. And you have to think in the design, in the context of your design, how small do you really want something? And it's easy to get too small. But I'll come back to that in a little bit. So this is a graphic design here that really accentuates these grid modules. We could see really clearly this is a grid module, this is a grid module, this is a grid module. The interesting thing here is that the text actually spans 2 modules. So it doesn't mean that you have to be stuck into here's one grid module, here's another grid module, and I can only put stuff in this and I can only put stuff in that. You can always break this. You can have the text span. You can have an image span multiple. Those are all options that are available to you. So working with these basic grids. The idea behind a grid is that you're trying to somehow organize the space such that it's easy to understand the content. If it has multiple pages, the content flows nicely from page to page. There's some underlying backbone of structure that we might not see all the time, but at the same time kind of organizes what's happening on a particular page. It should be apparent without being seen. And I think this is one of those things that you'll learn as we go forward in graphic design. I'll emphasize it when we get to the portfolio pages. And that is that really, really good graphic design is not something you ever notice or see. It's bad graphic design that you notice and see. So the best graphic design in a portfolio, the absolute best graphic design you have is that you no longer pay any attention to what is the structure of the page. You pay 100% of your attention goes to what is on the page, the content of the page. That's the best graphic design. If you can be so dragged into this particular document that all you see is what it's about, that's the most successful that you could possibly be as a graphic designer. So it's really not about the design itself. You want that to go away, which is counterintuitive. It helps you compose the visual elements to balance and contrast and shape the overall page. So where do certain things go? A lot of this you can feed back into those compositional techniques that we talked about in the photography section of the class. So when we're working with basic grids, we don't want to just slap a grid on that we don't think about. We don't just take the page and divide it up and say, "Yep, there's my grid, that works." We want to think about what are the proportions of the grid? How is that based on the complexity of the page? How many little modules do I want to have on the page? How big should a module be? How small should a module be? How big should a line of text be? You want to think about your content, your design, and then make an educated decision about what this grid should be. It's kind of like if I were designing a building and said, you know what, I'm going to make a grid of 8 foot by 8 foot because that's a convenient size. And then you go to say, okay, well, I need to do a lecture hall in that 8 foot by 8 foot grid. Well, wait a minute, it's too small. I can't do a lecture hall in 8 feet by 8 feet. Furthermore, I couldn't do it in 16 by 16. So suddenly my grid doesn't make any sense anymore. So we don't just arbitrarily slap a grid on. We think about what it is that we're designing and then make an informed decision about what that grid should be. We'll cover more about that in a little bit. Single column grids. Sounds kind of silly, right? Single column grid is essentially the page itself. We're using that whole page to show our content. This is perfect for large amounts of text. Let's say we're doing your English paper or your history paper. There's a whole bunch of text that you got to fit in there. This is a good space for that. The space itself is defined by the margins. We talked about the margins earlier in the class today. That's the space around that big block of text that drives you into the active content of the page. The other thing, though, is that margins often need adjustments. If you open up your Word document, it has some default margins in it. Most of us just go with it. but you can actually adjust those margins, and you can think about what they should be. If we're doing facing pages, like this example here, we do need to adjust the margins. They're not even all the way around the page. The classical layout is that the sides and the bottom tend to be a little bit larger than the top, which is not the way Word is laid out, by the way. The top is generally a little bit smaller. The inner margin is usually half the width of the outer margin. So the outer margin here is going to be wider than the inner margin. Pick up a book and take a look at it, and you'll see this kind of thing happen. The positions tend to be mirrored if we're doing a spread. If we're doing a facing page, where they are on one side tends to be mirrored on the other side. So here's our example page, just blown up a little bit. This is what I was saying. This here is, if that was 1, this here would be a half, for example. The bottom, in this example, the bottom's not that big. Generally, the bottom's a little bit bigger, and the top is a little bit smaller, if we compare those two. Notice that the page numbers are down here in the margin space. That's a supporting element, not the content itself. Remember the rule of thirds. So in photography, we emphasize the rule of thirds over and over and over and over again. We emphasize diagonals. We emphasize radial compositions. We emphasize all these things, especially the rule of thirds. That doesn't mean that you can forget it when you start thinking about graphic design. That flow line is a great place to have rule of thirds. If you divide up the column, you could divide it rule of thirds. And you could place your content based on those compositional techniques, and that really helps. So don't forget about those techniques as we go forward. Multiple column grids. So we talked about the single column grid, perfect for large quantities of text. The multiple column grid obviously extends the possibilities quite a bit. They're going to contain several spatial intervals, i.e. columns, depending on what it is that you're designing. A lot of options. They're suitable for complex projects with lots of content, lots of mixed content, text, photos, things going together like that. You can create movement, drama, rhythm, tension using those particular elements. So let's take a look at this particular poster blown up just a little bit. So if we were looking at this particular poster, how many columns do you see? Okay, 3. I would argue that maybe there's one more column. So the obvious columns would be 1, 2, and 3. True? 3 columns of text. This one here, even though the text is going the opposite direction, is another column. So it's a visual element. We think of columns just as blocks of text, but not necessarily. So in this case, that would be another one. I would even argue that maybe this empty space on the edge is its own column. And potentially this empty space over here is also a column. So while initially this appears to be a 3-column layout, it's actually more of a 7-column layout. 6-column. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6-column layout. So it's important to kind of be aware of those kinds of things. And it also means that we don't have to think of a column just as text in little horizontal chunks. So I think this is a great way of showing that we can break the column. It's still a column, but the text is going in the opposite direction. And that provides visual interest and contrast. Modular grids are extensions of multiple column grids with the addition of horizontal flow lines. We kind of touched on this a lot. This results in a page divided into spatial units. There's that example again that shows all of our little grid modules. When we think about determining the size of one of these modules, it's really based on the content. What do we want to put in? What's the smallest thing we want to show? What's the smallest photograph or illustration? And I see this happen. You guys work on computers. Let's say you're doing a big presentation board. You're working on the computer. You can Control+, you zoom in. You get this thing all laid out. Oh, it looks great. And then you go to print it, and you have this little tiny drawing in the corner because you blew it up and it looked great on the computer. But when you go to print it, when it's at its full size, it's just too small. So you want to think about what it is that we want to see and how easy it is to see that. The first portfolio I ever did when I was applying to grad school, and I'll come back to these portfolios. I used to have them. I don't have them anymore. I did 7 complete portfolios before I settled on my portfolio for grad school. And the first one that I ever did, the grid modules were way too small. The things I was trying to show were way too small. You'd look at the portfolio and it's like there's all this stuff on it, but you couldn't see any detail about anything because they were just too small. If you think about a line of text, what is an appropriate length for that line of text? If it's too small, you have like one word per line and it's awkward to read. If it's too big, let's say that I had text that started here and it was 12-point font and went all the way to the end of the whiteboard there. If I tried to read it, I'd have to like walk along as I was reading it because it's too long of a line of text. So you want to figure out what it is that you're trying to show and what's appropriate for that length. What's easy to read? You want people to read it. What's easy to read? This is a bunch of examples of layouts and how they might come together. I don't know if this is the best slide in the world. We're going to keep going. When you add these modular grids, you increase that compositional flexibility. Grid modules need to be flexible enough to accommodate changing content over the course of the project. And I think this is a particularly important slide when it comes to designing a multi-page document. Is this as important when you're doing a single layout for that poster? Not necessarily. But if you think about your portfolio here, this is a good example. You have a bunch of different content that's going to go into your portfolio. The sizes of your drawings are going to vary. You might have a 24 by 36 drawing. You might have an 11 by 17 drawing. You might have an 8.5 by 11 drawing. You might have a completely different panorama, something long and skinny, all of which you want to put into your portfolio. How does the basic backbone, how does that grid backbone in your portfolio accommodate all these various sizes? That's a really important thing to consider when you look at that portfolio. We've talked all about the rectilinear grids, the traditional grids. Well, what happens if we have an alternative grid? This involves a lot of intuition. This looks right, this doesn't look right. Trust that little person talking to you saying this is good, this is bad. It's a lot about intuitive placement of objects. Compositional techniques work great here. Strong diagonal, for example, in your composition. They often evolve from the basic grids. You take the grids apart, you slant them over on a diagonal, you adjust that way. But it can be really complicated for getting good quality content on a particular page. Visual elements need to define the page itself. So you're now taking away that grid backbone for organization, and you have to think about what's important, how do I draw a person into that importance. So your compositional structure is based on a dominant visual element in that poster. So let's look at this poster, for example. So the last one I pulled up, remember, had a distinct column layout. If we were to look at this particular one, is there a column? Maybe. You know, you could argue that maybe this section in here is a kind of a column, sort of. I don't think there's a column on the other half of the page, though. So it doesn't fit neatly into that anymore. So what is it that defines this particular page? What do you focus on? What do you draw your attention to? And I think that's an interesting question. It's effective, but why? So I think one of the strong elements on this page is these strong diagonals. We've got a strong diagonal working that way. We've got a strong diagonal working that way. We've got the planes in the background, these gray pieces here, that are helping to show us that perspective. We've got the splits in the text that are helping to define that. And all of those things are pointing us right here. So it's the visual elements, it's those diagonals that are drawing our eye. When you first look at this, they're saying, what is it that you're looking at? They're drawing our eye to that piece right there. And lo and behold, that's where it tells us that this is an exhibition and a fashion show. So it's the visual elements that are defining what it is that we're seeing. So it's not a traditional grid. We're using those compositional factors, those diagonals, to draw us in and have us understand where we should start looking at this poster. And I think when you're doing this kind of an alternative layout, a lot of it is about what is it that you want somebody to see first, and how do you draw people's attention to that particular element. A couple other examples. This is more of a portfolio style layout, but you could tell that these two pages belong together. They follow the same underlying grid, but they're not a normal grid by any means. So on this page, we have this strong diagonal here. Guess what? That strong diagonal still exists right here. So there's a consistency page to page. We have another set of diagonals right here that matches this set of diagonals there. So even though those aren't even parallel, they're consistent page to page. Doesn't mean that the content is consistent. I mean, how the text is formed is totally different, but we have that strong contrast. This diagonal right there matches this diagonal right there. So you can see I'm starting to draw what that grid would be right on top of these pages. So it does have a grid, it's just not a traditional grid. And again, it's based a lot on intuitive, what looks right, where do these diagonals fall, what feels right for those particular diagonals. Breaking the grid. Even if you have your standard rectilinear grid, even if it's not the fancy grid, diagonals or whatever, the grids are always meant to be just a base. They're meant to be something that you can follow that generally organizes your content. But it doesn't mean that you can't selectively remove part of that or selectively choose to span multiple modules. Maybe the text spans multiple modules. Maybe one of the pictures is large. Those are okay. You're intelligently, as the designer, breaking the grid to draw importance. You guys have probably been in buildings that do this, where they have a strict grid of columns. And then suddenly one of those columns is taken away and the space opens up. You're naturally drawn to that place where the column's taken away. That's okay. We can do the same thing graphically, where we have a strong grid, we choose to break it in one place, and suddenly that draws your attention. Use the grid as a guide, not a dictator. So it's there to help you, not to force you. And that's an important distinction. If, however, you keep breaking it, you find that, oh, well, this doesn't really fit, so I'm going to break it here. And suddenly I'm going to break it there. If you break it too often, then the grid's not the right grid in the first place. So you might want to go back and rethink what is the right grid and what it should look like. The interaction of visual elements. We essentially want to develop a strong hierarchy for how we view the content on a particular page. We want to have a clear focal point that attracts the eye and brings the viewer into this particular document. And then we meld in the subordinate other information. The less important information comes a little bit later. So we drag somebody in, and then as they get in, and as they start thinking about it, and as they start reading it, they get more and more information. You want to lead the viewer through a logical and meaningful journey of your content. If a hierarchy is not established, the eye gets distracted and you move on. That's really important. If it's not well organized, you just go, whatever, and you move on. And this is very true. You've seen this in advertisements. You go walking around, you take BART, and you look at ads. Some ads draw you in, and you get interested, and you want to look at them. Other ones, you don't really know what you're looking at, and you forget it. And you move on. So let's look at this particular poster larger. What's the most important element on the page? If we were to rank, what's the most important element? National Portfolio Day. I completely agree. So this element right here is number 1. What's number 2? Could be California College of the Arts. Could be Saturday, January 19th. Those are tied in my book for the next level. There's a clear hierarchy here. National Portfolio Day. Second level, there and there. What's the third level? It's probably whatever is right here. We'll call that 3. What's the fourth level? It's probably this. That's 4. What's the fifth level? It's whatever is down here that I definitely can't read. That would be 5. So there's a clear hierarchy. So the designer of this particular poster thought about what's the most important thing that I'm trying to tell people? It's National Portfolio Day. What's the second most important thing? When it is and who's hosting it. What's the third most important? Whatever those things say. Does that make sense? So we're clearly establishing what is most important, what is next most important, and we have that hierarchy in a poster. All the posters that I've showed you so far have this hierarchy in it. We could go back and do the same analysis. 12.6.3.1. I think this is a good way of thinking about your designs. And it works for graphic designs, it works for posters, but it also works for presentation boards. So what you want here is you want to think about what does somebody see from the back of the room. So if, for example, I was looking at this particular poster, and I had it pulled up, and I stood in the back of the room, and I was just a casual observer. I was walking in, etc. If I looked at this and I said, oh, that's interesting, that's a poster, what's the most important element? Again, number one item, National Portfolio Day. My eye responds to that, and I can see it clearly from back here. As I start to get closer, so I use 12, 6, 3, 1, but you could do it at any distances. Essentially, you start somewhere and you move halfway closer. Is there something on the poster that suddenly gives you more information, that's more interesting, that you didn't see back there that you can now see as you get closer? That's good graphic design because it's causing you to move into the poster and get more interested and read more about this particular thing. So I've moved halfway. I've moved to the 6. Oh, there's more information. Here's when it is. Yeah, I'm starting to get more interested. Let me move in a little bit closer. I move halfway again. Now I'm at 3 feet. And I'm exaggerating because this poster is gigantic. Okay? But now I get closer and I start to read the other elements that are on the page, the smaller things. And then I get all the way in to the close, and I'm looking right at it, and I see things that I couldn't see from the back. And I'm still interested and I'm still engaged. So if you think about an architectural presentation or an industrial design presentation, you're up there, you're trying to grab somebody's attention, you're trying to get somebody interested in what it is you're selling, whatever that product would be. You want somebody from the back of the room to be interested, and you want somebody sitting in the front row to still be interested. If the person in the back row sees the same thing as the person in the front row, the person in the front row is going to get bored. You've seen it in your presentations where somebody who's a guest reviewer comes up and they start to look at something really close. You've seen this happen. That's because you engage them at a close level. The best designers think about all of these scales at once to make sure that somebody's interested up close and somebody's dragged in from far away. Hierarchy. How do we get started? We could just rank the elements by importance. These are the things that I'm trying to list. What's most important? What's second most important? What's third most important? And you see that I keep showing this same poster series because it's a good example. We've already kind of ranked what are the most important pieces. The next most important pieces, they go in toward the background. Space provides the visual contrast that helps us have this ordering system and to be able to see it. It's kind of like the margins that go around the page. It's something that defines what is active and what is not. It gives space around our elements to let those elements stand out and or breathe. If everything's crammed together really close and there's no space around it, it's hard to tell what's important and what's not because they're all meshed and glued together. Empty space brings elements alive. And I see this a lot in young designers. They feel like, oh, there's too much blank space on this page. I got to add some more stuff. Doesn't look like I have enough. Well, design is a lot about the empty space. It's as important, if not more important, than the stuff that you put on the page. It's having space around. Focus on the negative space as well as the positive space. The positive space being the active content, the negative space being the passive content, the stuff around that active content. Space is really important for navigation and letting your eye go through the particular drawing, presentation, etc. It directs you toward the positive areas and lets you focus on those. So this is I think it's a book cover. The most important element on this page is the empty space. That's what draws you in. It's this space right here. It's right in the center. You get into this drawing through that space. Then you start to say, oh, wait a minute, it says master, and then wait, what? Oh, that says pieces. Oh, that's kind of interesting. And then you start to look at whatever the content is. So that negative space is actually a really strong visual element that's dragging you in to this particular design. Using space to your advantage. If you group your elements together, generally that provides a focal point, and the space then goes around. If you center an object and equalize the space around the object, it completely inactivates the space. It becomes not important. So how you place the object in the space is very important. Placing off-center creates a weighted asymmetrical composition. This is just like in the photography world, rule of thirds here. Active space, passive space, same concept. You also don't want to have too much space. So if, for example, I had a blank piece of paper and I had a little bit of content and I said, okay, I'm going to put my content right here. Okay, well, there's way too much space around the page. That's a problem. And I also centered the content right in the very middle of the page. So both of those are bad. If I said, OK, well, I'm going to improve that. I'm going to put it right like this. Well, it's better because it's bigger, but it's still centered in the middle of the page. It still is deactivated by all this space around it. However, if I took the same image at the same size and I put it here, suddenly the space is helping activate the page. It's letting me do a layout. Maybe I add some more text right here. So I have my element, I have a text, right? Maybe I have a series of other pieces of text like that, or whatever. I have a flow line, I have a column interval, that's lined up. You see how I start to build this out. So the space around, all this space, matters. And it helps you create that composition in the first place. So thinking about space is absolutely critical. Scale. Scale can be used to establish hierarchy. Some of the posters have kind of already shown that. But if you have something that's bigger, sometimes you look at that bigger thing first. So if we look at this particular poster, the dance poster, the title of the dance poster is the biggest element on the page. We focus our attention there because it's bigger. As the various things get smaller, they become less important and they go to the background. So just size or scale can cause this kind of a transformation. Use consistency and progression when changing scale. So don't just say, hey, this one's big, this one's a little smaller, this one's a little smaller. Think about, let's say in font terms, this is easier. The big one's going to be 16 point. The next one down, or 18 point. The next one down is going to be 14 point. The next one down is going to be 12 point. The next one's going to be 10 point. You follow how I'm kind of ticking my way down, and I'm being consistent with it and thinking about those elements. Quantity. Like I said, space is important on a particular page. So quantity, how many things should be on the page? If there's too many, it feels cluttered. If there's not enough, it could feel empty. So we have two different ways of going about this, and it depends on how you design. Some people use an additive method, some people use a subtractive method. The subtractive method would be, this is all the stuff I have, let me put it all on the page, and I'll see what it looks like. And then I subtract off, well, this one's not that important, I'll pull that one off. Well, this one's not, no, I'll pull that one off. Oh, this feels about right. The additive method is you put one thing on the page, and you say, nah, it doesn't quite feel. Add one more thing. Yeah, it's getting there. Add one more thing. Yeah, that's about right. Put one more thing on. No, that's too much. Take it back away. So it depends on how you think as a designer. Do you start with one big thing and keep adding to it? Do you put everything on the page and subtract from it? And it depends on who you are as a designer as to which method you're going to use. Make sure that all the elements on the page have a specific function. There's a reason for them to be on the page. You're not just arbitrarily throwing some stuff on the page. Orientation and position. Depending on how you orient and position your elements, you can create a strong hierarchy that can, or a strong contrast that can enhance your hierarchy. So I'm going to blow this one up in just a second here. But essentially, on this particular example, all the primary elements are running horizontal. There's all the text. There, 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 there. The photographic background gives us this wonderful line right there. That's a vertical contrast to all the horizontal. And that then becomes the focal point. So if we look at this with its content there, right, I am a true followed by dreamer. That reversal happening right here provides our focal point for the whole design. So it's the contrast between the horizontals and this vertical that provides our focal point in this particular design. It's subtle, but it works and it's effective. Depth, dimension, and perspective. You can use this to your advantage too. If you put elements on a page in perspective where one thing appears visually behind another thing which appears visually behind another thing, that can lead to this is most important, this is second most, this is third most. So you're establishing hierarchy using three-dimensional space. That's definitely something that you can do. It moves the composition away from a flat composition. But again, it's a style decision. Do you want to have things that are presented in that manner? Layering elements can also create depth. Sometimes transparency of elements can create depth. Sometimes people put, like in the portfolio, they put a bar that's semi-transparent with some text on it that goes over the top of something. That's a strategy. So how you layer stuff can make a difference as well. Typography. We spent the whole class last time talking about typography. It's really, really important. So don't forget about it. Pay careful attention to it. Typography is as important as all the rest of the elements on the page. So you treat it as an important element just like you would any of the visual elements, any of the photos, etc. Remember to think macro and micro scales. We talked about this last class. What does the overall paragraph look like? What about the individual space between characters? Big scale, large scale of the typography. Color. Suddenly you put a little bit of color into a graphic design or a layout. That can be a big thing. It might be subtle. It might be everything on the page is black and white, and you have just a little accent of color, just a little pop of color. Guess what? That pop of color is always going to drag your eye in. Doesn't take much. You can also use a comprehensive color palette. So you can use one color or you can use a bunch of colors. Both are effective. You just want to think about how you're using it and why. We will have a lecture later on in class about color theory and why you might pick one color over another and which colors you should choose, etc. For now, picking a color versus not picking color is what we're talking about. You want to consider the tone of the design with regard to the colors used. This is one thing that I've seen be particularly effective in like architectural presentations or whatever, is that somebody will do the bulk of their work in black and white, and then they'll have just a little bit of accent color sprinkled throughout the particular drawing or presentation boards. And it really draws your eye in. If you imagined everything in black and white and suddenly there was just a tiny bit of red here and just a tiny bit of red there and just a tiny bit of red there, that's going to draw your attention to these various pieces. So a little bit of color use can be a particularly effective way of drawing attention. Shapes and linear elements. People love to put these in portfolios. And I was just as guilty as all of you. They can be effective. They can drag you in. They can show you where the content is on the page. Unfortunately, they get overused very frequently. There become too many lines, too many crosses, too many little extra details that really are unnecessary and end up distracting from the graphic design as a whole. A single bold graphic shape can serve great as a little background or as a way of targeting a particular piece of information, but it can also be overdone. And you just really want to be aware of that as you start to add elements. So in review, you as the designer are responsible for creating some kind of an established hierarchy. What's most important, what's second most important, what's third, fourth, fifth, etc., going down the list. You order and control that design based on the hierarchy. So we establish it first, then we order and control the design to make sure that the person who's looking at the page is drawn in and sees it in the right order. We then use contrast to establish those focal areas. So what do we see first? How does the overall page direct us to that spot to see first? And then we use our compositional factors to support the design. What is the rest of the composition doing to help with that focal point and drawing us in? Okay, so we're going to switch over into, I forgot. I got a few more portfolio examples to show you. These are, I'll go through them rather quickly because we'll spend a whole class lecture on portfolios. But you can see just how these start to fold together. So we've got the distinct columns. We've got the column intervals. They're clear to see here because they're highlighted in yellow. We've combined them for the single image on the next page. Now we move to the single column, one big block of text. There's a lot more text that wants to be seen. We move on here. Notice the flow line stayed consistent between those two pages. So here we are, the top of the block of text is at the same level as the top of the block of text here, which matches the image that goes all the way across. So there's careful consideration for how these things are laid out page to page. Combine two of the columns together. There's that single block of text again. Okay, so now we'll move on. I'm going to flip over onto the other computer here, and we'll walk through some of the more advanced layout techniques in terms of alignments and that sort of thing. So bear with me while I switch over, and then we'll keep going. Okay, so on we go in the world of InDesign. What I'm asking you to do in your exercise 111 is essentially a practice round for what you're doing for your assignment. So this is where you can play around with layouts. You can mess around with how do you combine images together, frames together, etc. Work through your alignment techniques on a small scale. So this is just practice for where we're going. I say this is a general information postcard. If you want to do a practice round of lecture series, that's fine with me. Just something to do with the architecture or industrial design programs. So I am asking it for it to be smaller. So it was a 4x6. So in this case, I'll switch my units into inches. And then I can choose to have, say, 4 inches by 6 inches by typing those in. The orientation, whether it's landscape or portrait, is entirely up to you. It doesn't make any difference to me how you want to lay it out. My margins, I'm going to go ahead and, again, set them to 0. We could adjust them, but I think probably because of the size of this, it would be a full bleed. It would go all the way to the edges. So I'm just going to set those to 0. The rest of these are fine, but I am going to uncheck facing pages because I don't need to have facing pages. It's not a booklet. I'll go ahead and click Create here. And that then gives me my overall little postcard layout to start working with. So as we start to lay things out on a particular page, we've already talked through the frame tool, for example, the rectangular frame tool. But sometimes we have multiple images, or we're trying to establish what this grid is, etc. And so as we do that, a couple things that can be advantageous. One, if you want to specify the size of a particular frame, instead of clicking and dragging and trying to line up or read the little gray box and get it exactly, let's say I wanted 1 inch by 1 inch in this case, it would be hard to get exactly to 1 inch by 1 inch. I probably could get there if I tried hard enough with the mouse, but that's really difficult. The alternative would be, instead of clicking and dragging, to actually just single click, and it'll bring up this rectangular box where you can type in the value that you want. So if I knew I wanted it to be 1 inch by 1 inch, I could say OK, and that then gives me this particular box. So now that I have that box, let's say I want a couple more of them. I could take it, I could go to Edit and then Copy and then Edit and Paste. That would create a second one. And I'll put this up here. The good news about the Creative Cloud now is that there are some alignment tools that kind of help you lay out. So for example, I can come up here and I'll get those green lines. That'll help me lay this out so that they're in line. I'm going to leave them slightly off because I want to go through the Align window so that you guys can see that as well. Let me paste in a few more examples here. There's my third one. Go up a little higher like that. And so let's say, in this scenario, that I have these 3 pieces and I want them to line up. If I go to Window and then Object and Layout and choose Align, it will bring up this Align tool panel right here. And this can be really useful. We're going to go through these various Align options to start. So if I were to select all 3 of these objects, like that, again, I'm using the black arrow to select those objects. I have all 3 of those objects selected. I can choose to align the objects, say, to the top. So I could click on this Align Top Edges button, and all 3 of those would align up to the top. But what if, and when I did that, notice that this one was the high one, and it took these 2 and pushed them up to meet it, right, like that. But what if this one was actually the one that I wanted everything else to align with? I can choose what is called a key object. So after I've selected these objects, all 3 are selected, I can do a single click on one of the objects. It highlights it, and that becomes what is called the key object, and the Align will then reference that object. So if I now align to the top edge, those 2 will go to match this edge. So it's one extra click to assign, this is my key object, this is the one that I like. So if I was starting to lay this out and I wanted this to be centered, for example, I can drag this one object here such that it lines up to be centered on my page. I could even take it a step further and I could center it on the page this way. And I could use this object here as my key object, and then I could align the rest of the object. So I did an align on the top edge. I could also align the centers of the object, or I could align the bottoms of the object. It happens to all end up being the same in this particular scenario. So I've lined those up. That's good. These aligns would be if I wanted them to align centered horizontally instead of vertically. So I could align them all Should be on top of each other, essentially. In this case, I don't want to do that. That's good. But what about if I want to have a specific space in between these objects? So let's say that I knew I wanted 1/4 of an inch in between these two objects, or 1/8 of an inch in between these two objects. I could select these objects, pick the center one again as the key object, and I could come down here to distribute spacing, and I could choose what I want the spacing to be. So let's say it was 1/8, 0.125 inches, and I could say distribute the spacing. And it's going to make the space here and here exactly 1/8 of an inch. So I could take these three, now that they're put together, I could copy them, and I could edit, paste, and I could pull them up here. So same scenario. They happen to already align this direction, but they don't have the space that I want in between them. So I could select these two, make this the key object, and distribute the spacing that way. Then I could select these objects here, make this one the key object, and align them all to the top. So I'm working my way through to create this grid of shapes. Does that make sense so far? And how I'm using the align tools. The other option, let me go back to where it was here, is that I could take these three objects, I could right-click and say group them, which makes one object out of them. And I could take these objects, I could right-click and say group. And when I do that, I could then select both of these, picking this one as the key object, and distribute my spacing that way. The only challenge there is that sometimes you end up having to ungroup the objects after you've grouped them together. So let me go ahead and ungroup. So I have those two set up. Now, what about if I knew, let me copy this again, I'll bring it down here. I'm going to do a separate layout for these. What about if I knew that instead of this being here, I really wanted, or actually, I'll tell you what, let me do it this way. Let's say I had a smaller frame. I need a few more frames to explain this one. So let's say it was a 3/4 of an inch by 3/4 of an inch, like that. And I'm just going to create a bunch of them. Like that. What if I knew that I liked the placement of this object? Let's say, oh, I really like that placement, and I really like this placement. I wonder if I can make this one work. Let's see. I don't know if I'll have enough space, but we'll try. OK, so let's say that I wanted these to line up there and there. I like this object, and I like this object, but I have no idea what the spaces should be in here to make them all match up. I can select all 4 of these objects, and I can go to this distribute objects layout. I can distribute objects along the center. Let me pick a key object here. We can distribute along the center. Oops. There we go. Sorry, I didn't need to pick the key object. That was my mistake. Let me go back and do that one again for you. So I've selected all of these, and essentially I want the objects inside, there and there, those two, to have even spacing between them. So I leave the 2 outermost ones in place. I click on this distribute horizontal centers, and suddenly I now have those laid out so that the spacing is even there, there, and there. So I was able to pick the 2 outsides and then make the objects fit in the middle, which is another option for you. I could take these 3 pieces. I could group those 4. I could group those together. I could take these 3. I could group those together. Control G will do the group if you don't want to right-click on it. Then I could take these 2, and I could use my distribute spacing. Sorry, this is my key object. There we go, distribute spacing, and now they're 1/8 of an inch apart. So that's all part of the layout process. I don't know that I ultimately like breaking the grid into these modules, but I wanted to show you with smaller elements so you can see how that distribute spacing works. So let me go ahead and make a few more of these. Now notice as I drag that one down, it gives me a little green equal on either side. I'll do that one again so you can see it. It's hard because I can't point to it at the same time. There it is. It knows that I intuitively want them to be spaced evenly. So it's trying to help me out. It aligns it to the center, and it spaces it evenly so that I've got that. One more here, and we can go up to the top there. And there we go. So I've essentially established this basic grid to start working in. Now I could intuitively choose to break this grid. I could make one of these larger. So let me go ahead and select all of them. I'll right click and I'll say ungroup. And I could say, you know what, I really want this object to come down and span multiple frames. So I can just bring it down or bring it down. And I have one object, and I could end up deleting. Actually, you know what? I'm going to delete these two first, there and there. And I could say I want this one to be down like that. So I can do the same thing. I could say, let's get rid of these. And I could pull this one over like that. And I'm still working within the context of my original layout. Obviously, I haven't placed any images yet. But at this point, I could go in and I could start placing images. So I could take and select this one. I could go to File and then Place. And I could drop in what do we want today? 111? There we go. And I could drop in a particular image. Remember, I can right-click and say Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally. And now we've got that particular graphic showing up there. What if, however, go back to where I had all of these. What if I wanted an image not to just to make one of these frames larger? What if I wanted the same image to fill these 4 frames? I can do that too. And so in this scenario, I have to take these 4 frames, and I need to make them into one frame. And I do that by going up to the Object menu, by going to the Paths submenu, and choosing Make Compound Path. The keyboard shortcut for it is Control+8. And when I do that, you see that the little X now spans across all 4 of those. When that happens, and I select it, and I go to File and then Place, and I drop the same image in, that image spans across all of those. So I could right-click now, and I could say Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally, and you see that it now spans across those. That may or may not be something that you want to do, but I want to show you guys how to do it, should you want to. So one more time, let me go ahead and undo that and go back to where I had the original frames here. This time I'll do it with 6. Let me take those pieces. I'll go up to Object, Paths, Make Compound Path. It makes one large X. Then I can go to File and then Place, and I can drop that image in. Same thing, right-click, Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally, and now I've spanned across all of those frames themselves. So that's certainly an option. The other, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start creating multiple pages just so that I can flip and show you different examples. So let me go back to where I had just all the individual little squares there. Let me right-click and say Duplicate Spread. That lets me play with a new one. I don't have to stick with just my basic grid layout. So we did that. I can actually, instead of working with a rectangular frame, I could switch that rectangular frame into, say, an ellipse frame. So I could do a new frame that was an ellipse here. I could then get rid of these frames behind. Oops. Do that one more time, sorry. There. Get rid of that frame. And then I could place the image in this ellipse frame. So I could go to File and then Place. And I could drop that into that particular frame, should I want to. Now, what about if I wanted something that was a little bit more custom? So what if, let me go back here for a second. What if I wanted to work with diagonals? What if I wanted a frame to go from here down to the bottom as a diagonal? Well, instead of working with the Frame tool, I can work just with the Pen tool. So if I come down here a little bit further and I go to the Pen tool, I could actually start up here, and I could draw a diagonal, let's say, to there, to there, to there, there, and back over to there. And essentially what I've drawn is a shape. So there's that shape. And I can use that shape as a frame. It doesn't have an X in it, but I can use it as a frame. So I can go to File and then Place. I could take that same image, and I could place it in the frame. I could right-click, go to Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally, and now I have a diagonal piece. I could take it a step further. I could actually draw, again, oh, the one other thing I should point out, this particular frame right now has a black border around it. So if I don't want the black border, I need to come over here to my stroke color, click, hold, and say Apply None, which gives me the slash through it, which takes away the little border. If I wanted this like that, I could come in here with my pen tool. I could draw another frame like that, and then I could use my text tool to create a text frame for it. You can, under Type, sorry, I forget where this is. Fill with placeholder text. There you go. I knew it was here. You can have it filled with just text. This is like the Latin text that fills in so you can see what it would look like. I could select it, and I could go through all of my typography options to adjust what that looked like, what the size looked like, etc. So maybe this needs to be more like 8-point given the size of this. And let me go ahead and go back to Type and fill with placeholder text. There we go. So I could see essentially what it would look like. So you guys see how I'm starting to build this out as a composition. Maybe it needs a bigger title up front. Maybe it needs a flow line across the top. So we can continue to establish this. But I wanted to show you how this works. This text box has that black border around it. If I wanted the black border to go away, once again, I would click on the stroke here. I'd click, hold, and say Apply None. Oops, sorry, I have to select it first. There we go. Apply None. There you go. It doesn't have that border anymore. This also might be a place where you want to work with your justification options here. So maybe I wanted to make sure that I got a strong edge along that side so that you can see how they, instead of that ragged edge, depending on what I wanted it to look like. So you see I'm kind of working through this general idea. Let's see, what else? Sometimes people want a frame. I'm just going to create a brand new page here so that I can show you a few more examples. Sometimes people want a frame based on text. So let's say that I create a text box and I say, let's say DVC. I need to adjust the text properties. So obviously I need it to be larger here. And it's probably even a little larger than that. Let's say it's something like that. It's a little bit large, but this is also not the best font choice in the world. All right, let's say it's this one. I need this to be a little bit less. OK, so let's say it's this. I can take this text and I can turn it into an object. So if I go up to the Type menu here, I can go to Type and then Create Outlines. Now this permanently changes it from being text, so I can't go back and edit it anymore. So you want to make sure the font is right and the size is right before you do this. And when I say Create Outlines, so this is Type, Create Outlines, it converts this into an actual shape. So I could go in and I could edit the shape if I wanted to, but I can also use this shape to place an object. So I could go to File and then Place, and I could drop that same photograph behind the text itself. Right-click, Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally, and there it is behind the text. So sometimes people ask for that as a strategy. Let's see, what else? What else do people ask for? Sometimes people want gradients. So let me take that. I'll go to File and then Place. I'm not paying so much attention to the layout anymore because I'm trying to show you these techniques. Let me go to Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally. So now with this particular image, I can control, actually I should probably have a second image so you can see how these interact with each other. Let me do one more frame here. OK, so I have these two images. This top image here, I can control the opacity. So I can come over here, and in my appearance, I can go here to the opacity, and I can change how transparent that particular image is. So you see I can control how transparent it is. That's letting basically the image behind come through. I can also go into the Effects menu, so right here under FX, and I can deal with some of the drop shadows, inner shadows, etc. I generally stay away from most of these options, but we can get into some of the fancier options. If I go to Transparency, we're on Basic Blending. Guess what? Here's our blending modes. Multiply, Screen. Remember, we talked all about that? So I can control how something's applying. So if I wanted a image that had a white background to suddenly be lines, I can do it right here. So that's under Transparency. I can also come down here. Once I'm in Transparency, I can deal with a few of the others. I could go into, I think it's a Gradient Feather. This is going from being solid on one side to being transparent. I can control whether it's happening toward the right or up and down, etc. So let's do it toward the top because it'll be a little bit more obvious. I might have to type in 90 there. And now it's going from being solid at the bottom to being transparent up at the top. So I can make all of those options via this FX menu over here. I can turn it back off by unchecking it and making that go away, and now that would go back to being solid. So you're more than welcome to play around with those effects, but I wanted to at least show you that you could use blending modes and where they were hidden, and then also the gradient feather because sometimes that's an option. The drop shadows, if I'm being honest, I'm not a huge fan of the drop shadows. I'll turn this one on just so you can see it. It's that effect. It always looks kind of corny, especially in a portfolio. So I don't think it's the best. I think it's a lot better if you just do a clean layout without any kind of drop shadow. So I would stay away from that. But again, that's a personal preference. Let me go ahead and turn that one off. I'm trying to think what else. Remember all your paragraph styles, your character styles when you do your text and you start to lay those things out. Sometimes you might want, let me jump back to one of these early examples here. Say I was coming back here. If I was going to use this as the flow line, sometimes people like to add some kind of a dividing line in between. So let's say that I did something like that. I would give it a stroke color there, and I might also give it a stroke thickness. It's already at 1 point. That's not too bad. Remember, with these, I could take this, this, and that object there, and I could use this distribute objects so that I could get that one exactly in the center of those two objects. All right, so there that is. Now I could come in and I could say I want my text to go above this line. Something like that. And maybe I pull that one down. Maybe the font needs to get a little bit bigger. You're getting where I'm going with this. That then divides in flow line, and then maybe I fill in with other images. So these guys here become one image. So I'd go up to Object, Paths, Make Compound Path, then File, Place. We'll drop this one in. Right-click, Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally. Maybe these three need to become one, so I get rid of there and there. This then comes over like that. I go to File and then Place, and I drop this one in. Right-click, Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally, etc. So you get how I start to build this out. If you want to see your layout without all of the text boxes or whatever to see where you currently are, you can always switch in the View menu to your Screen Mode Preview. It's going to make all the objects go away, which sometimes makes it easier to see what it is that you're actually working on. I could do the same thing on one of these pages, like this one here, where I was working. When I'm in preview mode, it starts to be a little bit more obvious what I was creating versus the non-previewed mode. Once again, that was in View, Screen Mode, Normal. It's much harder to see with all the blue lines. So flip back and forth. It's harder to work without the blue lines. Or I say blue lines. It's because we're on layer 1, and layer 1 is blue. That's why the lines are blue. We'll get to layers next class in a little bit more detail. So I'm going to turn you guys loose to play around with this. This is what it's about today. Remember, today is a practice round for your poster. So do multiple layouts, experiment, see what works. Turn one of them in. It's a pass, not pass thing. So if it turns out really ugly, no worries. This is about the experimentation and learning the strategies that we're talking about. Did you have a question?
Yeah, so you know how you place an image into that
frame? Yes, that one.
How do you manipulate the individual letters?
Sure. So it's, one of the challenges with teaching you guys these software applications is in what order do I teach you things? And how do I choose to do one thing or the other? So when it comes to objects, I'm just going to use a rectangular frame to start here. We can manipulate the corners of objects using this white arrow, which is called the direct selection tool. It allows us to control the control points of the object. So if I had this square frame, rectangular frame, I clicked on the direct select icon, and I picked this point here, I now have control of that point, and I can manipulate that point in any manner that I want. If I wanted that point to become curving rather than being a sharp corner, I can select that point. I could come over to my properties here, and right there I can convert that point to being smooth. And when I do that, that becomes an arcing point. I can control how it arcs using these handles. And by dragging it out, I can make it bulge, etc. This takes practice to learn, obviously. We will do a lot with the pen tool later on the semester. We'll actually do the pen tool in Illustrator, but it's applicable to InDesign. It works exactly the same. And actually, there's a pen tool in Photoshop, too. But I tend to wait to teach it until we get into Illustrator because it takes a little bit more comfort with the programs before we get there. But for those of you that want to experiment with it, that pen tool, which I used today, all I did was I did single clicks, which makes sharp edge corners. If I wanted to do the pen tool and make some kind of a free-form object, when I start, so it's a single click to start, the next point here, I'm going to click, hold, and drag to create that tangent line. And then I can go through and keep clicking and holding to draw whatever it is that I want out of this particular shape. And then I can end up coming back to where the two meet. I might even take that last point there because it's not smooth and convert that one to being smooth, which gives me a little bit more of a free-form object. So you can draw anything. So your question, getting all the way back to that, was essentially when you've created the text. So I'll go back through creating the text again. So I took the text, I said DVC. There, we made the size big. Helps if I can type. All right, there it is. I'm just going to use this font. It's fine. I'll go up to Type and then Create Outlines. That then creates the object. Now, if I were to go in with the white arrow, the direct selection tool, I can pick any one of the control points of this object. So I could pick, say, that control point there, and I can manipulate that particular control point or this particular control point to do whatever it is that I want to do with it. This works the same way after I've placed the file. So I can go into File and then Place. I can drop the file in like that. And I can still, with the direct select, go in and make adjustments and get more or less of the image. So even if my image was rectangular like this, and I went to File and then Place, the frames work exactly the same as they would with or without a placed object inside. So I can still manipulate this particular piece and adjust it however it is that I want. There does come a point when my object is, there it is. I lose my object and it gets cut off because my object is not big enough to fill the frame entirely. So at that point, should I really want this particular shape, I can always right-click and go to Fitting and say Fill Frame Proportionally, and that'll enlarge the object so that it fits. All right, those were great questions. Any other questions? No? OK, I'll let you guys work for a while. If you come across something that you want to walk through, let me know, and we'll go from there.